This originally was a job talk presentation I did for a academic job application. And I actually had in mind that it would be a motivational, educational style presentation. I think of it as sort of like a presentation style manifesto to look at landscape architecture and landscape design. I'm going to go deep already in the beginning. We often question what is landscape architecture because landscape architecture is pretty broad. And I actually want to make it a little bit more philosophical and ask the question, what is real landscape architecture? My work is very philosophical, and in the profession, from my experience or outside of academia, philosophy and spirituality is seen as something quite separate, not part of the everyday work. That's why I'm starting with the question of what is real landscape architecture. These are some of the projects I worked on while I was working in an office. Some of them were finished after I already left the office. So in that case, would they be considered real landscape architecture while I was there? Or does it mean that it's real landscape architecture when it's created in real life, in our physical life? Or is some documentation about our place in the world landscape architecture? These are questions for us to think about when we think about not just landscape architecture, but work in general. Was work something that needs to have some sort of product that we come out with, or is change in our mental sphere psychologically enough? So I come to this idea that when we claim that something is real or realistic, we are often claiming that this something is of value and that we want to maintain it. But what does that mean about the things that are claimed to be unrealistic, abstract, or ideal? When we say that something is too unrealistic in order to achieve, or that it's something abstract and not worthy of going further, it's too idealistic for our world. Is that something that we do not value and we don't want? Do we still want to maintain that idealization, or do we want to manifest that into the world? And I think that starts with the misguided aspect of philosophy. Because outside of academia, philosophy is often seen as something superfluous, like a luxury that brings very little of value other than intellectual entertainment. There's little incentive to be philosophical in a lot of the work that we do. On a practical sense, philosophy is often seen as, in some cases, in opposition to productivity and work. So we want to do more all the time and not have enough time to think about bigger things like that. But on the other hand, in academia, I've seen people engage with philosophy like scientists, observing specimens under a microscope, looking at philosophical text as if it's something to dissect. And for me, it's not really sure where the next step goes from there. But philosophy is actually, if we go back to the Greek meaning, it's the love of wisdom. And if wisdom brings us to making choices and creating a better world and life for ourselves. So if philosophy is the love of wisdom, then philosophy informs our ability to know ourselves and the world and make sound choices. So my research, or particularly my PhD research, was, I think I would say, restoring personal philosophies in landscape architecture through qualitative research. And particularly, I was working with the methodology of phenomenology, which is the study of experience, and hermeneutics, the study of interpretation, and also reflexivity, which is study of my own or the researcher's own interpretations, involvements, reflections about how they relate to the material that's studied. So my PhD research was on how poignant landscape experiences influence landscape architects and their interpretations of what it means to flourish as human beings and as landscape architects. What I did was I put out surveys, interviews, and I also analyzed professional association documents such as charters, codes, website, text, etc. To sum it down simply, I was studying how we interpret our experiences of being human in this world through our relationship with landscapes. In that particular case, I was looking at landscape architects as a particular group of human beings who have a special relationship with landscapes. In that aspect, my research goes beyond the boundaries of a professional's work or a discipline or a profession, and really looking at human beings in general and looking at landscape architecture as a case study of human beings in a particular way. One of the first questions I asked my interview participants was, why do landscape architects become landscape architects? Like, why did you become a landscape architect? What I got out of the answers were basically two things. One is possibly an internal calling. Many people had an internal calling to the profession. They felt that they were somehow led or felt that there was a really deep soul connection. And two, which was quite common as well, was that it was a discovery process. They were somehow maybe called or intrigued by getting into the profession, not really knowing what it was, and having then discovering it through the process of working in it. And I say that landscape architecture in my life was a combination of the two, which is also a common possibility. But in one case, I think of it as an internal calling that did not match my discovery of the profession. To put it bluntly, I was a bit disillusioned by how incomparable my soul deep calling and I would say in heart-wrenching connection to landscapes, particularly, not necessarily to landscape architecture, I guess, on hindsight, was to this kind of a limited satisfaction I was getting through the job. It may be counter-rational for me to bring this up as a motivational presentation. I'm doing this for whoever who feels like they're disempowered as a landscape design professional. And I think that's part of my discovery process of empowerment, is to recognize that disillusionment in what I was doing and how it didn't necessarily fulfill my greater desires that I wanted to manifest or express myself into this world. This delusion was why I went back to school to research on landscapes and landscape architecture so that I could rediscover my original intrinsic connection to the meaning of landscape architecture. One theory I developed out of my research to help me get to the essence of landscape architecture, for me at least, is the notion of the landscape architect as archetype. This is based on Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious and also eco-psychologist James Hillman's notion of the soul of the world, also known as anima mundi. Through the two concepts, I reconceptualized the title or the idea of the landscape architect as a kind of modern archetype, one who navigates the complexities of the social and ecological world through a relationship with landscapes. For those who don't know what an archetype is, or whoever needs some reminder, archetypes are generated figures that represent qualities that can be found universally in our collective consciousness. For example, some of the common ones are mother, father, hero, maiden. And tarot cards or other divinatory systems, such as the Chinese I Ching, also consist of archetypal elements important to our development journey as a human being. So I'm going to get into what the more detailed description I have about the landscape archetype. This archetype is a co-creator of places for human dwelling, a steward of land and culture, a transdisciplinary professional, a compassionate individual who sees their work as personal growth and social responsibility, and a person who is wise enough to know their place in the world, but also humble enough to know that they are always in a state of becoming. Now, if you are a landscape architect watching this, I'm not sure if you'd be burdened by these big responsibilities this archetype has, or you may be resonating with the archetype already, whether you're a landscape architect or someone else doing related work or just interested in the areas around the profession. There's some ambitions and struggles within this archetype. And it's not a surprise because I didn't really make these characteristics up. They were actually themes I put together based on the interviews, the discussions I had with real landscape architects, research participants that I had in my PhD study about being a landscape architect and what goes through in their minds. Since I'm pretty observant about the world and worked in the profession for a while, I know that not all real landscape architects embody this archetype. Also, it's kind of hard to embody this archetype in full because having all these characteristics are so ideal. But I have to say that because it's an archetype, all human beings with the desire and commitment to create a better world learn to live life and make change through this landscape archetype. The world the landscape archetype strives for is what I call a flourishing commons. This flourishing commons is a place where we grow and heal together as individuals. And within that phrase, healing together as individuals, is a paradox or a complementary dualism, because as our minds are trained to work with binaries, when we see ourselves as separate entities, it's really hard to see ourselves as a collective unit at the same time. Sometimes we are able to see each one of those aspects separately, but to see together as individuals at the same time, it's a little difficult. So to work through this paradox, we need a paradigm shift that involves being and not thinking. And I would go back to the way we look at morality to really start off this shift. Conventional morality sees actions or thoughts, beliefs as good or bad judgments, but an ethic of flourishing sees morality as relational. Ethical agents, like everyone who chooses to be, make autonomous choices to flourish in a world of social and ecological systems. The idea of autonomy is very important because we can't flourish if we're not sovereign. If we are drifting along with the crowd, or if we feel so ultimately oppressed to the point of abandoning our power to choose, then there's no aspect of flourishing there. The ethic of flourishing comes from scholar Chris Kimmel's work in this book, Feminism and Ecological Communities, an Ethic of Flourishing. And also, it also has roots in Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, which translates as happiness, fulfillment, or flourishing in itself. So flourishing is reciprocal. Robin Wall Kimmerer, Indigenous American plant biologist, in her book Braiding Sweetgrass, really popular, has said all flourishing is mutual. So we know that flourishing is a reciprocal phenomenon between individual and environment. First, so an individual will flourish if their environment allows them to do so. So they have an environment that is supportive of their flourishing. And in reciprocality of this, a flourishing individual will strengthen the flourishing of their environment. Well, at the same time, when we look at our experiences of the world, they are personal and subjective. So the other aspect of the reciprocality of being a flourishing individual in a flourishing world is mitigating that subjective and personal experience with our collective existence, because our collective existence is dependent, as a species, is dependent on us sharing our experiential interpretations, or what I would simply call narratives or stories of our lives. So according to philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer, within our understanding of the world is already the perpetual anticipation of meaning based on understanding. This simply means that we can communicate with each other and make sense of the world because we already have preconceptions of the world within us. In other words, our understanding of the world, or our narratives that we have of it, is inherently biased or naturally biased. The scientific method of research assumes that we can kind of park our biases and be purely objective. But when we are truly participating in the world, we fundamentally operate through some sort of bias. We can kind of separate that bias, like through mindfulness, so that it doesn't be the motivational factor of our actions. There is some bias there in the way we understand the world. And to create new knowledge, or if you like the landscape metaphor, then we have to expand our horizons of expanding our horizons of understanding in the way that we think of knowledge means that we need to disturb existing biases that we already have and then reestablish new agreements of understanding. And I want to note here that disturbing does not mean controlling change by force or manipulation, which has really been the case for much of the history of human civilization. Disturbing means to simply interrupt the status quo to create an opening for something new. And that's why I have the picture of the ripples in the water, because that's something, just a simple disturbance of the stillness of the water, which is a good metaphor for disturbing biases. This means that if we want to change ourselves or environment, we need to disturb existing hegemonic or normative narratives and reestablish new ones. Maybe activists and advocates may do this in very ambitious gestures, such as declarations and manifestos, which I guess this is one way I'm already doing this, since I call this a manifesto-style presentation, but it's informative as well. But we do this also subconsciously or consciously in everyday encounters. And if you're just watching this video because you want to, then maybe can include this as a very simple everyday encounter. Then if we think of it that way, our choices are, basically our choices are the place for disturbing biases, the way we make choices. And I guess I would kind of ask you to think about what guided you to make certain choices, very simple choices like watching this presentation. Yes, oftentimes we make very rational choices, rational reasons to do things, or even emotional, I guess. But sometimes we really just don't need rational reasons to guide us to the right place. That's really how intuition works. They're not rational reasons. Something just tells us to do it. And part of that is curiosity. We need curiosity to start being guided in this way without the rational aspect. And curiosity is something that is really the foundation to disturbing biases, because that is the principle behind the Zen Buddhist concept of shoshin, which is also known as beginner's mind. By the way, shoshin, if you translate that literally, it really means the original heart. So we are finding the heart to landscape architecture here. And if you think of it that way, how original heart went into beginner's mind, there is some sort of twist into translation, the way we think of Eastern and Western philosophy or of worldviews about our relationship with the world. The curiosity or the openness of the mind or heart is the prerequisite for breaking biases. In watching this video today, I'd kind of set the stage to see if through your curiosity of what I will share, can we, well, me and you in whatever we have to work with, can we break through the prejudices that you've gathered about landscape architecture and being a design professional? Or if you're not a landscape architect or a design professional, maybe there's something else you can break through by watching this presentation. We won't really know until the end, and maybe even beyond that, for things to percolate. But that's the starting point. So to break biases, we still need to start off at some sort of point of agreement. And that's why I'm going to start with looking at design and placemaking for our times and really asking the question of why do we design?